of the invitation to study with you once again. And I do hope that what I can offer will prove of interest and help to us. I also want to add, as I may have mentioned in the past, I do have some hearing loss. So if at any point I seem to be answering a question that was never asked, I usually can read that on the faces, but I just wanted to mention that that's Thank you, and good morning. I referred to our study today and next week as a study of women and divine calling in Hebrew Scripture. And I chose that way of describing what we're going to be studying because it's a little broader than the initial thought that this would be women and prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. And I hope that by the conclusion of our session today, the reason that I've chosen a slightly broader expression will become more clear. But for now, I would begin by saying that this morning we're not going to start out with biblical texts that are specifically related to prophetic titles or callings, though as I've said, that's where we're headed. But with a biblical passage that appears to be rooted genuinely in a perspective that can, I think, inform our reading of biblical sources that do use such titles. The passage that I'd like to begin with is the first and second chapter of Exodus. I'd like to summarize these texts in the following way. The book of Exodus begins with a genealogy having to do with children of Jacob who make their way to Egypt. It's then followed by the plotting of the Pharaoh to ensure that these outsiders remain fully subject to Egyptian authority, which eventually, as you'll recall, leads to enslavement. Followed by the edict that all Hebrew male children are to be killed, while the females may remain alive. Followed at the beginning of chapter 2 by the birth of a male Hebrew, whose mother chooses to hide him until that no longer seems feasible, places him in the Nile in a basket, where he's recovered by the daughter of Pharaoh, a member of the royal family, taken out of the water by her servant girls, and then we're told that this baby's older sister had been watching and approaches the daughter of Pharaoh and says, wait, you're going to need someone to nurse that baby. Should I find someone? The daughter of Pharaoh says, well, yes. And she brings the baby back to their mother to be nursed. It would appear that it's that relationship, perhaps the relationship with the daughter of Pharaoh, that clues in this child as he grows that he's in fact actually a Hebrew. We're told he goes out to see what he can find out about their condition. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He intervenes, kills the Egyptian, hides the body. The next day he sees two Hebrew men fighting, attempts to intervene. They tell him, oh, so you're the boss around here. You're going to kill me like you killed him. He flees because the Pharaoh sets up an edict to kill this man, Moses. He flees to Midian, where he encounters a group of women caring for a flock of sheep. They're being driven away from the well. He intervenes on their behalf and becomes a member of their family. That's the first 2 chapters of Exodus. But let me go back through those passages now in the following way. It begins with a genealogy. The genealogy of the children of Jacob that leaves out his daughter, Dinah. And then the text is parsed repeatedly by sexually identified characters. Men who repeatedly act in oppressive and or violent ways. The Pharaoh, his taskmaster. The young man, Moses, who kills an Egyptian. The male shepherds who drive away the children of the priest of Midian, all girls. That is to say, the first 2 chapters of Exodus are all about men repeatedly described as oppressive and or violent. And the females, well, that would be, first of all, the 2 midwives who conspire against the Pharaoh to save the male babies. Moses' mother, who refuses to comply and saves her son. Pharaoh's daughter and her retinue, who take the baby out of the water. Moses' sister, who's standing by. And let us keep in mind, the biblical text appears to be well aware of the fact he had a brother, but nowhere to be seen. Moses' sister, who intervenes and then arranges rather cleverly to link this baby back up with his mother. The 7 daughters who are caring for their father's sheep, all women described in dramatically different terms. Women who care and who make sure that those who would be violently oppressed are somehow rescued. That difference in gender is too strong and too consistent not to be significant as an indicator of something commonly assumed by biblical narrators, if not necessarily all of their audience. I'd like to turn now to the first biblical text that describes a woman as a prophet. But I do so with what we've just seen in mind. It appears, and I think it would be helpful to keep in mind, that there is an underlying biblical perspective so dramatically exemplified by the first 2 chapters of Exodus regarding women as divine agents in a male-dominated world. A world permeated by the sorts of behaviors attributed specifically to men in the opening chapters of Exodus. Before we go to that first woman prophet, any initial comments? Yes, please.
I've just never heard of it described that way before. I know the whole story, but I've never thought about the roles of the women versus the men.
And
I love it.
Thank you, Connie. And I think in this passage, the distinction is so consistent that it precludes accident.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you. Well then, the first woman in the Hebrew Bible described as a Nevi'ah, prophet in the feminine. That woman is Moses' sister. And we are led to assume, once we learn her name, that she must be the same sister who rescued him as a child. I want to say a word about the root of the word Navi, or in the feminine, Nevi'ah. The root is closely associated with sound. It could, in fact, be onomatopoeia. And then speaking out. It's possibly related to a word for bubbling, and certainly with babbling. In the passive and reflexive form, it connotes ecstasis, the kind of explosive speech that isn't necessarily coherent, isn't necessarily directed toward a listener, simply emerges from someone. And there are such biblical passages, most notably Numbers chapter 11, in which that's the form, especially when it is grammatically passive or reflexive. That is to say, prophesying to yourself sounds like blah, 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 but it's inspired. As a title, this word Navi or Nevi'ah indicates a spokesperson. Most specifically in biblical text, a spokesperson for God. And as we noted in our previous study together, this calling as a spokesperson for God is repeatedly associated with disruptive speech, divinely inspired confrontation, interruption, and reproof. There are a number of references to prophet groups in the Hebrew Bible, bands of people who have this title. But interestingly, no such group ever rises to the level of prominence in biblical sources allotted to lone individual prophets, which also seems significant. Hebrew biblical prophecy consistently bears the marks of a particular person called to speak out. And now that first woman. Exodus chapter 15. Immediately following the Israelites' crossing of the sea in flight from the Egyptian army, we're told they broke out in song. The prologue to that song credits Moses with its origin. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to God. But immediately following the text of the Song of Moses, the Song at the Sea, we read this. And then Miriam, the prophet, the sister of Aaron, took a drum in her hand, and all of the women went out after her with drums and dancing. And Miriam chanted, "Sing to God, because God has done greatly. Horse and its rider thrown into the sea." The first reference to a woman carrying the title of Neviah. It's clearly a very old paean that precedes that reference. The Song of Moses is in Old Hebrew. It sounds like it might have been part of a larger poetic collection that was then inserted at this point in the biblical narrative. It is typically biblical in its inspired and stunning inversion of lofty Egyptian power symbolized by the horse. Throughout biblical literature, horses are problematic and primarily indicators of power. The horse and its rider thrown into the sea for the sake of lowly Hebrews. That's typically biblical. But is there anything about the use of the word prophet in this initial passage used to describe Miriam that strikes you as prophetic in any way we explored together in the past, or any way that you are familiar with? Anything about her behavior that would seem to call out the need to identify her specifically in this context as a prophet? Please, what?
Well, it sounds to me from 20th century, or 21st century years, that she's preaching, actually. She's proclaiming. This is proclamation. And we typically see that, at least in this tradition, as intending to speak the word of God directly to people.
I think that's really insightful, and I appreciate it. Anybody want to build on that? Yes, please.
Well, she's leading others in that.
And she does clearly have a leading role, and it seems to be a leadership position that is sustained to some degree, at least, by her capacity to inspire. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, it says that women were with her when she sang this.
Yes.
It doesn't say that the men joined in.
It does not, interestingly, and as we'll see, there seems to be a pattern in that regard, that victory songs are specifically associated with women. Interesting.
So, are you reading to them in 21 as just the women then? Miriam sang to them. No, but the next verse, after she goes on with singing,
Women are with her.
Miriam sang to them.
In the Hebrew, thank you for asking. In the Hebrew, it says chanted to them using the masculine, which could be inclusive or specific. What an interesting observation. So it's not as if the women respond because she's directed the chant specifically to them. That's an interesting thought, and what do you make of that?
Well, see, I've always looked at this and said, Miriam's the one that sang the whole big song.
Uh-huh.
And somehow that wasn't, some editor thought, I better give it to Moses. But they couldn't delete the tradition that Miriam, I mean, it's the same opening line. So either she repeats just the opening line of the song, or somewhere in the tradition, it was taken away from her.
That's a wonderful observation, and when we get to the Song of Deborah, we might well ask, could we be seeing what you're describing in this particular case? Wonderful. Yes?
Another interpretation is that as a people, they have been liberated.
Yes.
And the women are saying, look within our community, we are still oppressing some of us in this community.
It could be, in fact, that what we're seeing in this chant and dance is an artifact of some degree of marginalization, even if the message is directed to the people as a whole. Thank you. Anything more before we go on?
Actually, I have a question. I mean,
Please.
can you maybe just, I think a lot of us, when I hear the word prophet, it's thinking about, I don't know, telling the future or speaking for God and of something that's going to happen. Could you maybe just take a quick second to talk about how, like, why in this case would she be called a prophet?
Thank you. We are, in fact, going to be looking at texts that seem to broaden what would be the more conventional assumption about the use of the title. As we explored it in the past, it seems to be about calling to disrupt or disorder what must not proceed. And if that's a definitive characteristic, however the form, whether it's predictive of some consequence if that disruption does not hold, it would appear that at least in this initial encounter with a woman described in that way, that association with disruption does not appear to be an immediate association. And I'd like us to keep that in mind. Thank you for asking. Let me simply conclude in this regard that it would seem that if we are to note a growing pattern of gender-related distinction, these first two sources, the opening chapters of Exodus, and then this initial passage from later in the book, in which a woman is described as a Neviah, should help us, or at least keep us sensitive to the possibility that gender distinction in biblical sources is perhaps not fully collaborating with gender subjugation. That there is perhaps some subversive implication to associating women with this role that has to do with pushing back on that subjugation. But let's see if that's where the sources take us. The next text in which a woman is described as a Neviah is in the book of Judges. And that woman is Deborah. Historically, the context is what has been referred to as a period of Israelite divine anarchy, about 11 or 1200 years before Jesus, in between the entry of at least some landless migrant Hebrews who had been liberated and fled from Egypt, but almost certainly portions of the settled population as well, who become associated with what we might describe as a movement. No kings movement. So, Israelite divine anarchy. Or perhaps more accurately, no kings down here. One king there. This period will end eventually with the establishment of Israelite monarchies under Saul and then David. But it's commonly referred to in that pre-monarchical period as the age of the judges. In Hebrew, Shoftim. We'll use the plural for now. Judges. In biblical Hebrew, that word root indicates both serving as a judge in a dispute, litigation, and a chieftain. You could use the word in Old Hebrew both ways. Numerous Israelite leaders of the period are described in this way, including Deborah, Devorah in Hebrew, which is a bee. Deborah, the bee. She is described in chapter 4 of Judges as having a set of roles. Let's take a look at that now. In the Hebrew, literally, and Deborah, a woman, a prophet, wife of Lapidot, she judged, but we would keep in mind that also implies was the chieftain of Israel at that time. And lest we think that the word judge only means chieftain in this context, no, it goes on to say, oh, she would sit under the tree of Deborah, the palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Beit El, and the highlands of Ephraim, and all of the Israelites would come to her for judgment, or perhaps justice. What then ensues is a war. The passage that follows tells us that she enlists a man named Barak ben Avinom, and she tells him that she has been commanded by God to fight back against those that would oppress these largely landless, newly settled, marginalized Hebrew Israelites. a war ensues, but she tells Barak, crucial to the victory that you will receive is the message that those you defeat fell to the leadership of a woman. And then the song. And here, interestingly enough, chapter 5, in direct parallel, but contrast to the beginning of the Song of Moses, the Song of Deborah starts, Vatashar Devorah. Then Deborah sang, and Barak ben Abinoam, the man that she commissioned to lead the troops. And the Song of Deborah follows. There is this reference to the eccentricity of a victorious woman, warrior, chieftain that precedes a song. But there's no such association with being a woman prophet. It would appear that the text is distinguishing between her two titles. When you, Barak, prove victorious against our oppressors, the word will get out that they fell to the leadership of a woman. But nothing comparable about a woman prophet. That title stands, which suggests that perhaps the notion of a woman inspired is something different than the notion of, oh, a woman warrior chieftain who can use violent means to achieve just ends. That, as we've seen, sounds more like a man, and so the surprise. I would only note a couple of passages in the song. However, I do want to emphasize that once again, like Miriam and the singing and the dancing women who lined the road after David struck down Goliath, Deborah is also associated with a victory song. But there seems to be some connection, some consistent connection between such singing and women. First 21 verses of the song in chapter 5, despite the violence throughout the poem, do lead to a reference to women, or more specifically to Deborah as a mother in Israel. That is found in verse 7. The beginning of the song is about how these marginalized Hebrew Israelites had suffered, had been pushed literally to the side, and then ad shekamti devorah, until there arose Deborah. And kamti in the Hebrew is actually the first person. So it could be read, until I, Deborah, arose. Shekamti, that I arose, a mother in Israel. A peculiar title to introduce in the middle of a victory song. Any thoughts about that?
Right here.
Yes, please.
I'm just wondering how Deborah got to this point.
Yes, there doesn't seem to be a preceding narrative that has survived that would describe why Deborah. No calling narrative, only the status once it's achieved. Yes, please.
Well, reading back a little bit, it's actually Jael who drove the tent peg into
You're right.
Sisera's head. And she was part of a clan that was at peace, I think. I'm not reading this very thoroughly, but it sounds like that they were at peace, and yet she killed.
At the very least, we are meeting a range of women who behave in ways which is nowhere near a kind of Victorian feminine ideal. These are women of action. The question is, as we pursue these initial texts, is the action in any way consistently associated with their woman? Yes, please.
I've long since forgotten my Hebrew from seminary days. Is there any nuance in the word mother that would suggest a more universal kind of mother versus like my mom, to kind of add breadth to that term?
It's a crucial question. It's a question that we're going to be pursuing ever after. But for now, I would say I think it's worth considering,
Okay.
including the possibility of a usage which for the most part otherwise fades from the text, but not the position. Let me simply note that in regard to David's question, if the term mother is used, it appears to be rather powerfully disassociated from biology. That is to say, one could be a mother in Israel without giving birth. I want to note in this regard that already in the 15th century, a Spanish Jewish scholar by the name of Yitzhak Arama, in his biblical philosophical commentary, The Binding of Isaac, he called the book The Binding of Isaac. His name was Isaac, and that was an ironic reference. He describes women as presented in the biblical text as male plus. And he gives a couple examples, one from narrative and one simply in terms of terminology. He says, when the first human has been divided into gender, has been divided into sex, that human looks at the other human and uses the same word used to describe him for her, except that it's in the feminine. And Arama says, in that first case, what we're looking at is something far closer to the way in English we would use the word human. Gendered, but human. Arama then says, females also have the power to give birth. Male plus. But he then goes on to say, if a female does not have that power, they are simply lowered again to the level of the male. That's Arama's position. The same moral and social responsibility. And he says specifically in introducing that idea, it can be learned from all of the imahot, the mothers, tzadkaniot, the righteous women, the niviot, the women prophets in Scripture. That to be a woman from a biblical perspective is to be a man plus. And that if you lose that birthing plus, you then are as a man. And his narrative example is, interestingly, when Rachel cries out to Jacob, "Oh my God, I might as well be dead. I can't give birth to children." And Jacob answers in anger. Arama says, that's because he was aware of this. No. Just because you're not giving birth to children doesn't mean you are 100%. Doesn't mean you are not 100% absolutely and completely a human like any other human, male or female. It's a very powerful observation, and I lay it out for you because I think Arama, some 600 years ago, read the text pretty well. Against the wind of convention that he no doubt faced as a thinker in 15th century Spain. We'll be coming back to that mothering, not as a biological function, but as an embodiment of caring, sharing, and second chances. Perhaps not leading to matriarchy, but maybe to a biblical.
Sometimes I just tune it out. Okay.
Nope. I think maybe what we're about to see is a biblical matriarchism. Not subject to the power of men, but responsive to the caring ethos characteristic of women. Yes, please.
Well, one thing you've taught me in previous sessions is the echoes we hear across Scripture, including the songs of the women.
Yes.
And you just showed us a passage where Moses' sister came out with the women at the end and sang almost an ending, an epilogue to the other song.
Yes.
And if you look at this song, there's also an epilogue.
Yes.
And it's also the mothers coming up and observing, in this case with this English translation, through the window appeared
Yes.
the mother
Yes.
asking questions. The wisest of her ladies answered her. Indeed, she keeps saying to herself, are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A woman or two for each man.
Yes. And that woman looking out the window is the mother of the enemy.
Yeah.
As if to say, this understanding of what it means to be a woman is perhaps peculiarly biblical, or something that emerges amidst the free, open anarchy of this stage in biblical history. And among these liberated Israelites, a seed is planted that has to do with gender as well. And that caricature of the mother of the enemy puts that in contrast.
Or again, saying within this liberation,
Structure. Yeah.
women are still being
Yes,
oppressed. Right?
maybe, but I mean to suggest that the song would not have had a comparable image of a Hebrew Israelite mother looking out the window and expecting that of her children. But the distinction has to do not so much with gender in this case, but a broader understanding of what it meant to be an Israelite. But thank you. There is one more text about a woman titled a Nebiah, a prophetess, associated with a period several hundred years later that I'd like to close with this morning. This text from near the conclusion of the book of Kings, part 2, describes an incident that occurred around the beginning of the 6th century before the Common Era, in the shadow of the approaching conquest of Judea by the Babylonian Empire. The Judean king Josiah is said to have launched a reform movement that included rehabbing the temple in Jerusalem, and in the midst of that construction project, an unfamiliar scroll is found. Modern historical criticism assumes almost certainly that we're talking about a copy of the book of what we call today Deuteronomy. But given the circumstances of its discovery and its unfamiliarity, an expert is called and consulted regarding its authenticity. And that expert is Huldah, the prophetess. 2 Kings chapter 22. We could look at that text. It appears that there's a consultation in verse 14 of several male officials who decide that they'll consult Huldah HaNevi'ah, Huldah the prophet. Huldah, by the way, is once again an animal name. If Deborah was Deborah the bee, Huldah, a weasel. Huldah is to be consulted. She's described as the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the son of Harchem, Shomer HaBegadim. It's in the masculine. Shomer HaBegadim means the person in charge of the clothing. Apparently somebody who worked in the temple who made sure that the priestly vestments were well taken care of. But it clearly does not refer to Huldah. She was not the person in charge of the closet. It was her husband. She was the prophet. The text briefly indicates that in examining this text, she confirms its authenticity, links it to a powerful criticism of the way things have gone in Judea as a justification for an approaching catastrophe. Then proceeds to say, but because there's been some regret and remorse, there can be some recompense for that as well. But in this case, Huldah doesn't make her way into the text as an inspired chanter or a chieftain. She appears to have been consulted instead in light of her apparent expertise in discerning the authenticity of the scroll. And I want to introduce one more word that we're going to talk about at some length next week as a counterpoint to prophet. And that word is chokhmah, usually translated as wisdom, but in biblical context can connote expertise as well. It looks as if this Neviah, this prophetess, is described as wise. And it's that wise expertise that recommends her as an authority in verifying the provenance of that text. For the moment, I'd like to leave that point where it is. Except to say that I think the Huldah text provides us an apt transition to the theme I'd like to begin with next week. And that is the wisdom of women. The biblical text never specifies that women's prophecy is distinct, although perhaps we've seen evidence of that. The text does come closer to saying there is something about women's judgment that is particular to their identity. At the very least, we can say, if David's Solomon exemplified a wise man, God help us. While, as we're going to explore, women described in biblical texts as wise offer a form of inspired leadership and disruptive reproof, distinctly characteristic in the Hebrew Bible of perhaps wise women and wise women prophets. Guidance and reproof akin to other forms of biblical prophecy, but as we'll see, ultimately attuned to rescue and reconciliation, like those women we first met in the opening verses of Exodus. And let me simply close with the observation. It was, after all, Eve, not Adam, who first recognized something beautiful about the fruits of knowledge. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much, as always, for your kind and thoughtful hospitality. Last week, we began with a set of biblical texts that describe particular women as being a prophet, a Neviah. Miriam, Deborah, Huldah. But we began with a passage at the beginning of the book of Exodus that does not mention prophecy at all, but I suggested we keep in mind as we reflect on the notion of divine calling in a broader, more diverse, inspired, and inspiring way. If we were interested in getting a sense of biblical voices regarding what it meant to be a woman acting with divine purpose, perhaps those first couple of chapters in Exodus might help to get us into a deeper social context. And you recall, yes?
I'm sorry, would you like us to have Bibles?
Oh, yes,
I'll have to pull it in.
thank you, thank you. Yes, please. And you'll recall that those first 2 chapters of Exodus, if you read carefully, are all about men hell-bent on violence and domination, and women who free the people around them through loyal relationships. And that if we keep that distinction in mind, perhaps it'll help to inform what we see in other texts more explicit about giving women the title prophet, or, as we will explore a little more deeply today, wise. Yes, please.
Well, I'm interested in how all the women's stories disappeared. Disappeared has been translated. How did we lose that feminine perspective?
Yes, I appreciate that. Well, of course, you can only read biblical text with the eyes that you have at any given time and place subsequent to their composition. So one can say, perhaps, there were facets of early biblical culture that reflected a social reality that later became more and more difficult to see, to read, to observe. I think texts that we're going to do today will help us to appreciate, perhaps, how broadly our distraction from this quality of the biblical narrative has become. Yep, absolutely. Yes, please.
Just an observation I'll pass along relating to that, and that is that it has appeared to me in recent years that the main force that seems to bias our views of the scriptures, unbalance those views, is simply selective reading. Passages that don't fit with somebody's biases have a tendency to be ignored a lot.
Tendentious reading. Reading that has a set purpose before you listen to the text in its voice. Yes. Let alone, as we'll see today, a text or two that I would expect would be completely lost in most curricula having to do with Scripture, simply because of their placement and their apparent marginal quality, when in fact, as we will see, the last text we studied this morning, I think, is among the most memorable of all biblical passages. And I say that with sincere honesty. So let's move in that direction, but thank you for the observation. In light of what we've just said, this morning I'd like to look at a set of biblical narratives about the actions of women described not explicitly as being a prophet, but as wise. In the feminine, chachama, wise women. And then a passage that we'll conclude with about the actions of a woman who simply took action. Actions that so effectively, I think, embody the prophetic calling to confront abusive power without saying a word. But to introduce the theme, the first references to wisdom, chokhmah in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible are all associated with Egyptian government policy. 3 at the close of Genesis in connection with Joseph's rise to power in Egypt. Another at the beginning of Exodus. regarding the Pharaoh's stated intention to outsmart the Hebrew aliens by enslaving them. And then as a designation for Egyptian experts enlisted to counter Moses' sign of divine agency, turning Aaron's staff into a snake. It certainly isn't a momentous introduction for the notion of wisdom in a biblical context. If the book of Proverbs reflected later social and cultural developments, and that book comes to exalt what it refers to as wisdom, as chokhmah, these first several narrative references suggest something far less necessarily or inherently noble. That wisdom depends on the application. It would appear that this strain of biblical narrative saw such wise men as closer to what we might refer to as cunning, or as I said, expert, rather than as wise as we might more commonly use the term. Expert in their ways, as was, as we saw last week, Huldah the prophet in hers when consulted regarding the scroll found during renovations in the temple. Or as wise, expert men and women recruited to construct and decorate the desert tent sanctuary are described in the latter part of the book of Exodus, also using this word. That chokhmah that we so commonly oversimplify as wise, and you know what that means. Biblical texts are about to suggest not so simple, and maybe we don't yet know what that means. The texts we're going to be looking at in detail this morning all come from the book of Samuel. It includes references to a wise person that clearly come with very different connotations. References not to wise men, but to wise women. This book, the book of Samuel, centers on how the Hebrew tribal alliance became a monarchy, and all of the ensuing crises that went with that radical transformation of what appeared to be the original Israelite confederation with minimal hierarchy into a conventional monarchy with conventional insiders and outsiders. Midway through the latter part of Samuel, what we refer to today as 2 Samuel, we meet a woman called explicitly Isha, a woman, Chachama. And we'll look at that text in just a moment. She appears to reflect a combination of skill and cunning, while toward the close of the book, a second wise woman, once again described as Chachama, steps beyond that role of wisdom as adept or skilled to courageously talk down an Israelite general. And then a third text that we close with about a woman not identified as wise or as a prophet. A woman who comes with the name Ritzpah, which could be translated as ember or the floor, that thing that you walk all over. That's the woman's name, not wise or a prophet, a concubine whose stunningly heroic actions, as we'll see, silently bespeak a striking prophetic disruption of cruel status quo politics. Despite marked differences in the biblical accounts of these women, the words and actions of all three result in a kind of confrontative intervention that we have come to associate with what the Hebrew Bible means by prophet. But intervention that does not lead to condemnation and punishment, but rescue and reconciliation. And so, the first of those texts in Samuel, 2 Samuel chapter 14. And with that, let me stop for a moment and ask if there are any questions, any comments thus far. Any thoughts about a more complex notion of what it means to have smarts? If not, let's look at this text from 2 Samuel. Just a bit about what precedes it. David might have been an exceedingly talented politician, but he proved a pretty awful family member. And it isn't long before his rise to power leads to chaos in the household. Perhaps one of the most disturbing and troubling of incidents is the rape of one of his daughters by one of his sons. Amnon's rape of Tamar, his sister. Tamar's full brother, Absalom, Avshalom, which perhaps you can hear, means simply in Hebrew, father of peace, goes to war against his brother. The brother who raped Absalom's sister is killed. Then he flees, and his father David is preoccupied by the loss of this favored son, Absalom. In chapter 14, verse 1, we read, "Then Joab, the son of Zeruiah, one of David's closest assistants, knew that the heart of the king was set on Absalom. And so Joab sends to Tekoa." Does anyone remember that town from an earlier conversation? Yes? That's Amos's hometown as well. That's right. Perhaps the text is alluding, perhaps just identifying the town. Joab sends to Tekoa, and he takes from there an Isha Chachama, a wise woman. And he gives her instructions. He wants her to personify, to act out in the king's presence a story, a message that Yoav believes might somehow lead to reconciliation between David and Absalom. The woman agrees to do this. She tells David a story about families in disarray. She claims it's her story and that she needs David's intervention. The conclusion of the episode is that David is deeply moved by the story, but comes to realize that perhaps there is something more going on than simply an anonymous woman who's come to him for help. Nevertheless, the woman's carrying out this task of acting out in the king's presence what it means to be bereft because of familial division proves successful, at least momentarily. One can only conclude that the wisdom, the chokhmah, attributed to this woman has something to do both with her skill and in conveying this message effectively that leads to a moment of reconciliation between David and Absalom, and something about the fact that it's a woman who conveys this story. I don't want to pursue this particular example of a wise woman much further, except to say that it seems to straddle definitions at this point. That is, it looks like Yoav has gone to this woman because there's something about the skill attributed to wise women that he needs for this purpose. Martin Buber, in an essay he dedicated to his daughter Eva, entitled "The Wisdom of Women and Their Actions," suggests that the text is indicating that along with the words that Yoav put in the woman's mouth were her own thoughts and challenges to David. And that when you put that together, the acting plus the spontaneous confrontation of this king, you hear something of what the text implies was her wisdom, skill and expertise, and something immediate about her presence. With that, however, I'd like to look at two more texts a little more carefully. Any thoughts before we move on?
Well, it's implied in what at least Buber was saying, a kind of charisma on part of the wise woman?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think a kind of personal power that goes beyond the words that Yoav had instructed her to say. Something that comes directly from her in the context of this encounter. Yes. Anything else? Please.
Well, my translation says the word wise can also mean clever or shrewd.
Yes.
Some believe it was Yoav was looking for a skilled improvisational actress.
Yes, yes, yes. As we've suggested, in this case, we might be seeing a little more of that connotation than wisdom as something elevated. But its application is specifically for the purpose of reconciliation, and Buber's suggestion that there seem to be aspects of this encounter that actually do come from this woman directly to this man indicate something of what the text means by a wise woman. Yes?
Well, in practical terms, she can start out giving her story with, if that's what Joab gave her,
Yes.
information. But then she has to interact
Yes.
with the king.
Yes.
So she has to keep in mind the goal
Yes.
of this reconciliation in choosing how to respond to the king's questions and back and forth. So, there's a limit to what she could get from Joab from that point on. Has to come from her ability to further the goal and read the king in terms of what's going to get through to him. And that's where her skill and wisdom in both empathy, in understanding the king, and the practical terms of, furthering the goal.
I think that is exactly what Buber had in mind. Thank you. Thank you. That was beautifully restated. The next text comes from the 20th chapter of 2 Samuel. There is yet another revolt against David. David's years were filled with attacks, breakdowns of authority, gross misapplication of his power, and revolt. In the 2 Samuel chapter 20 passage that we look at now, we learn about a revolt that takes place by a man named Sheba ben Bichri. And Sheba ben Bichri is chased down by David's general, once again Joab, and trapped in the city called Avela Beit Ma'acha. I'd like to pick up the narrative at verse 14. Here we read that the leader of this revolt appears to be trapped in the city because there is a siege that is set up against it, and all of the conventional tools used in the siege are applied. And it appears that the implication is that Joab is ready to slaughter the inhabitants of a city that would give refuge to a rebel against David's authority. But we read in verse 16, Vatikra Isha Chachama min ha'ir. But a wise woman called out from the city, listen, listen. This woman is described as wise. And her wisdom is once again applied in defense of others. As you can see, she attracts Joab's attention and then describes herself as Shlomei Emunei Yisrael, I am one dedicated to the peace and loyalty of the people, and you intend to kill a city that Em B'Yisrael, a city and mother in Israel. How would you say mother city in Greek? Mother city. Metropolis. A metro, a mother, polis, city. Apparently there was in antiquity an image that is both represented in Greek sources and here in biblical sources of a city, a town with surrounding people and settlements as a family presided over by a mother. You intend to kill off a mother and city in Israel. Why are you trying to swallow up this share for God? And Yoav backs off and says, Chalila, Chalila. Oh, God, no, I have no such intention. The woman says, let me talk to my people and give you the one person perhaps guilty of a crime. In verse 22, the text says, and then the woman came to the people and in her wisdom convinced them to give up this one rebel, Shevel ben Bikri, and as a result, the city was saved. Are there any echoes of text we've seen thus far that show up in this passage? Is there anything prophetic about it, first of all? This is a woman who confronts someone about to commit a horrendous act and says, come to your senses. You face a choice. The people of this town are innocent victims of your intentions. If there's a criminal here, we produce him. But this is a mother city in Israel. How dare you attack its people? And she succeeds. If I could just digress a moment to say, innocent people besieged by those outraged by a political act, who are threatened with suffering the consequences of those actions of a few who might be found in their midst. Just a story then and there? Oh my God, no. A story very much here and now. Those are our first two wise women texts. Once again, let me stop and ask any observations about their relationship to the prophet texts that we've studied together, both last week and earlier in the year. Is there anything about this calling of wisdom when applied to women seems in these texts to step beyond expertise to something we would identify more closely as associated with divine calling. Yes, please.
I was gonna say that with this wisdom seems to come, at least in my mind, an incredible amount of bravery.
Courage, absolutely. It appears that in this case, women's wisdom, as described in these texts, moves women to say no and to do it powerfully. And that they have the courage as well as the skill to place themselves in those positions and then speak. Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you. Anything else? Please.
I'm wondering if there's any indication of age of this wise woman. I mean, she seems to have a relationship with other powerful people.
In the town.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that she has their confidence. Yes, that it would make sense to say that it's not only the text saying she spoke with her wisdom, but that she also had some credibility. Yes, thank you.
And she has such stature and status that like what she negotiates is what happens.
Yes,
And
yes,
the city actually does.
Yes.
Sends it over.
wonderful. It's not simply talk, it's policy. Yes, absolutely. Anything else that you observed?
I took off the guy's head.
Yes, I would think it important to note that we're not looking at an overly romanticized notion of wisdom, women's wisdom. Yes, there's something very concrete, real, here and now about these women in these texts.
Was she willing for her head to be carried?
She,
Was she willing? But she was willing though too, for her head to be
yes,
carried.
yes, the alternative was absolutely, as we said, this willingness to step out is itself an indication of something the text seems to associate with this quality when it's found among women. Perhaps not so much in general or associated with the wise men of Scripture. As we conclude, I would like us to keep in mind, if I said last week, I believe, if Solomon is the epitome of the biblical wise man, God help us. There is a profound qualitative difference between the way in which these women step forward, the way in which settled later monarchical era sources describe what it means to be a wise guy. Yes? Yes. Well,
is there any significance, since there's been two today, that these women are not named?
yeah, And what do you make of that? Yes. In that
There's
regard,
something powerful about giving someone a name.
yes, in that regard, our last story flips the coin. It's a woman who has a name, but no title. That's interesting, that the title wise woman might be seen as actually displacing the person.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, that's an interesting thought. Let's, with that, turn to our last text. 2 Samuel chapter 21. A remarkable passage. It would appear to be perhaps an appendage to the larger narrative, as was apparently a practice with biblical texts. If you didn't know where to put something, you might attach it at the end. That seems perhaps to be the nature of this text. If so, however, it's well worth our attention. We're told at the beginning of the chapter, it was in those days, David's days, that there was a famine for 3 years. And David sought out God's presence. The term is extremely vague, intriguingly so. David sought out God's presence. This is a euphemism for an oracle. Was it a moment of personal inspiration? The text leaves that open, except to say that God replies, this is all about Saul and his bloody household, because they killed the Gibeonites. Does anyone recall the initial relationship between the invading Hebrew Israelite tribes and the people who lived in Canaan at the time, known as Gibeonites? According to the book of Joshua, the Gibeonites cut a deal with the invading Israelites. They say, we will submit if you don't wipe us out. And the Israelites make the deal. A few generations later, Saul, in his fervor, decides we don't need alien populations, and attacks the Gibeonites. With that, the survivors of that break in a covenant approach David, and they say to David, we want justice. 1 generation later. And in verse 3 we have David say to the Gibeonites, what do I do? How do I atone for this? How could it happen that you would then bless our people? And the Gibeonites answer, it's not a matter of silver or gold with Saul and his house. It's not us that have the authority to kill any Israelites. And David says, no, tell me what you mean. I'd like to stop for a moment and say, what is so striking about that moment in the exchange? The Gibeonites say, to make compensate us fully for what has happened, you can't pay us off with cash, and we don't have the authority to kill any Israelites. And David says, no, what do you mean? Go on. What do you make of that moment?
Seems like David is catching their hint.
Yes, thank you. If you read the text carefully, it's an ugly moment when David says, no, tell me what you mean. Why so? What do we know about what David brings to this moment that makes him follow up with, we Gibeonites don't have the power to kill any Israelites with, no, tell me, what do you want me to do? What do we know about this man's story?
That he's willing to kill some of his own people?
And if we're talking about the house of Saul, that the Gibeonites have their claim against, well, that was David's chief rival. And if there were survivors from the house of Saul, potential claimants of his throne. So when the Gibeonites say, we can't kill anybody, and our fight with the house of Saul can't be settled with cash, David says, no, tell me what you want. It's an ugly, ugly, and far too common David moment. And with that, they say, we would like 7 of his descendants killed and hooked up on the hill of Saul, where these descendants of the house of Saul can be humiliated with execution. Hooked up, hung, their bodies hung out. And the king says, verse 7. Oh yeah, you gotta do that. An ugly, ugly moment. But the king, he took pity on Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because David had an oath of devotion to Jonathan. Jonathan was his friend, so he wasn't going to include among these descendants of Saul that he was agreeing to murder the child of someone who was his good friend. No. Instead, he takes the 2 children of Rizpah bat Aiah, one of Saul's concubines, and 5 children of Michal or Merav bat Shaul, the daughter of Shaul. Depending on which manuscript you read, a different daughter is cited, Michal or Merav. Hands them over to the Gibeonites. They kill them and hang up the bodies on the hill of Saul, Givat Shaul. An ugly, ugly indication of David's willingness to play it dirty. It's all the more touching that there's some confusion in the manuscript history about where the 5 other children come from, because whether it was Merav or Michal, David had also apparently been romantically involved with those 2 daughters of Saul. So, if he has this high standing devotion to his friendship with Saul's son Jonathan, he's ready to murder 5 children of Saul's daughter. Either one, a daughter that could have and would be, in the case of Michal, his wife. He gives them over to the Gibeonites. They hang them up on the hill in God's presence. And they are there all summer.
Oh, look at that. Oh.
And Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took a sack. She laid it on a rock from the beginning of the harvest until it began to rain in the fall from the sky. And she didn't let any bird of the sky settle on them day or night. And David was told of what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, Saul's concubine, did. And David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from where they had been in the town of Yabesh Gilad, and he gives them a proper burial. And he brings up those bones, buries them properly, as they apparently have not been buried yet. He does that, and at that point, God is open to pleas on behalf of the land. So, let us think carefully about the actions of this woman. This woman named Floor, the thing you walk all over. Her sons are murdered by a king for the sake of some kind of political arrangement with the Gibeonites. They also serve his purpose of taking out of action potential rivals. The princess, be it Merav or Michal, is not described as intervening in any way. But this woman, a concubine, will not abandon the bodies of her son. She stands by them all summer, not allowing them to be attacked by birds of prey, until David hears of her action and buries all the bodies. And it's at that moment the text says that God listened again for a land in famine. What's prophetic about this woman's actions? In what way would you describe Rizpah as prophetic? It's confrontational. It's disruptive. Anything else about it that you would associate with what we've come to see as the nature of biblical prophecy?
Well, it's a rebuke.
It's a rebuke, absolutely. And it leads to a decision. That the biblical prophet is not only called to say no, but to say no, and now you have a choice. This woman, of about the absolute lowest status, doesn't speak a word, but if the Hebrew, Neviah, Navi, that root is associated with speech, this woman's actions speak volumes. And how do we know that?
But done in love. It's done in love.
It's done in love, yes, and devotion to her children. And what is the message? Who is moved to make a choice as a result? David. We're not told anything of the intervening reflections, thoughts, conversations, simply that this woman's loyalty to her children somehow sparks in David, the king of Israel, the need to think again about his disloyalty to people all around him, including the house of Saul. Her actions shout out across the boundaries marked by the narrative, across the millennia to us, here and now. Talk about good trouble. And the eloquence of non-violent civil disobedience. The capacity of this woman by her actions alone to reach David and say, oh, this is about breaking covenants, Saul with the Gibeonites? No. This is about you, David, and your inability to sustain relationships all around. Think again and choose. Dear God, if only all the prophets of Israel had spoken as efficaciously as Rizpah into silence. And with that, I would like to close in this way. There is a legend recounted in the Talmud that tells of a well that accompanied the liberated Israelites in the Sinai desert. If we wondered, where did they get their water from? Well, there was this legend that there was this well that rolled along with them from campsite to campsite until Miriam died, and then it dried up. I think that somewhere in that legend rests something of a convergent impression of Miriam the prophet and Miriam the rescuing sustainer, rescuer of her little brother Moses while still a young girl, and sustainer of the people Israel, a mother of Israel. In the 1980s, research by Carol Gilligan prompted discussion of what she called a different moral voice, one that she maintained strongly correlated with a form of moral judgment most commonly demonstrated by mature women. A voice that tends to prioritize relationships and responsibilities as strongly as ancient aristocracies emphasized submissive order, or classical liberal thought emphasizes rights and liberties. Gilligan's supporting research would be strongly criticized, but an ethic of caring is much older and broader than Carol Gilligan's attempt to empirically verify it. It was something biblical authors seem to have in mind when describing a vocation of confrontation and disruption voiced in womanly, wise ways. And so this. The first not good in Scripture comes a few verses after the litany of saw that it was good and very good at the opening of the creation narrative. That first not good, anybody know what it is? It seems not accidental that we have good, 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 not good. The first not good in Scripture is it's not good for a human being to be alone. And so God plans for what in the Hebrew is referred to as an ezer kenegdo. God reflects on what it's going to be like to be human and says, oh, it's not good to be alone. And ezer is a masculine noun. It means to help or to aid. Kenegdo is a little more complicated. But first, help. The passage that I've just cited is often described as God saying, the human is going to need a help, or a helpmate, or a helper. But the Hebrew for help is much more intriguing because it's usually describing God. As in the names Eliezer, El-Azar, Azariah, these letters, in which God is described in this way, which strongly suggests that far from connoting subservience, help in this case doesn't mean someone who's your aid. The word indicates something closer to someone who gives me what I need that I can't give myself. And then there's kenegdo. Kenegdo in the Hebrew means facing, in keeping with, equal to, opposing. So God describes this person, in essence, not a usable sex or gender, but a sustaining, corresponding human presence. An apt description, I think, for the women whose stories we've been reflecting on these past 2 weeks. Human as are men, and maybe then some. And to be this means to be fully equal in one's humanity, and then perhaps something more. Called to speak and act with a prophetic impetus among all too human fellow human beings. And so one last Talmudic reference. A couple thousand years ago, Rabbi El-Azar, God helps. Rabbi El-Azar said, what does the text really mean when it says, Ezer kenegdo, this help across from, corresponding to? What the text means is, if he's worthy, an ezer. If not worthy, the opposition, the voice that says no. That God created this other human being so that there would be someone to give us what we need, including at the crucial moment, the crucial no. So, the calling of a prophet. Thanks, everyone. Glad to be here.